Hi, my name is Eric Follick. I'm a Platonist contemplative ascetic, and I would like to read for you an essay that I wrote a few years ago that I hope will provide a concise but fairly complete account of Platonist meditation and spiritual practice, as well as a summary of Platonist metaphysics. You can see a print version of this essay at www.aumayosllc.com. That's E-U-M as in Mary, A-I-O-S LLC.com. aumayosllc.com. So this essay is called The Practice of Contemplation by Eric S. Follick. The formal practice of contemplation is the central transformative practice of the path to liberation. This is especially so in a spiritual system based on an idealist metaphysic. Conversely, such a metaphysic is implied by the fact that all the systems of the philosophia perennis, that is the perennial philosophy, or all the mystical systems of the world in general, even non-idealist ones, consider that the practice of, quote, meditation or contemplation is the means of changing one's mode or state of being. Since all is mind or spirit or thought, experience without referent, since reality is in fact contemplation, and knowing or experience is not possible without the absolutely essential practices of moral discipline, renunciation and asceticism, and the necessary ancillary study and reading and thought and reflection may all be taken as also being forms of contemplation. Contrary to the prevailing view in practice in these darkest of times, when, quote, meditation practice is, quote, taken up by worldlings all and sundry, without philosophical understanding, without giving up anything, and with a view just towards being healthy, wealthy, and wise, genuine spiritual contemplation is a difficult practice of contemplative ascetics, requiring renunciation of the world and worldly pursuits and desires, strict moral discipline, and the ability to think and discern clearly, and is based on a definite metaphysical or philosophical understanding or view of the nature of reality, and has a definite aim or telos. Telos is a Greek word for the final goal or aim. In this short essay, I would like to try and present a very brief discussion of Platonist contemplation practice. Plato and Plotinus were the greatest of mystics, contemplatives, and spiritual teachers. Although in modern times, the teaching of the divine Plato has, unfortunately, been presented as just, quote, philosophy, in the modern sense of the term, as just thinking about things. It is in fact a spiritual and soteriological system more akin to the Indian systems and the Greek systems of Orphism and Pythagoreanism. It has, however, happily, never become an organized institutional religion for the many, never has had an organized, ritualized monastic order, etc. This has allowed it to retain its purely transcendent spiritual nature and great liberating power, but perhaps has led many moderns to overlook its actual nature and content. Similarly, the dialectical form, and in the case of Plato himself, often symbolic, allegorical, and anagogical form of presentation used, may lead to a lack of understanding or appreciation. Platonism requires of the individual practicer, contemplative ascetic, or philosopher in the original Platonic sense of the term, considerable intelligence, discernment, and self-reliance. The goal or aim of the Platonic teaching, with, of course, its own uniqueness in various respects, is like the allied systems mentioned above, liberation from the endless miserable cycle of repeated birth and death, of individuated existence in space-time, and like at least some of the other systems, reunion with the Absolute. This should be obvious from, for example, an unbiased and informed reading of Plato's Phaedo, perhaps the core dialogue for the Platonist practitioner, and the key to understanding the rest of the Platonic corpus. That's the Phaedo, by the way, in English, how it's usually presented as Phaedo. The Phaedo, the dialogue that deals ostensibly with Socrates' last hours in prison, not to be confused with the Phaedrus, which is another dialogue, of course wonderful in itself, but not as accessible for this purpose immediately, and not the one I'm referring to here. Okay. As indicated above, real contemplation practice is based on, and in turn reveals, a metaphysic or understanding of reality. Of course, actual contemplative experience transcends and is ultimately not a matter of discursive understanding and constructs, but rather is a direct transformation of state of being and union with higher reality. But the expression of such contemplative accomplishment and transformation at the level of discursive thought yields definite understandings, and such understandings are, conversely, necessary for undertaking contemplative practice. Further, the attempt at conceptual understanding is in itself part of the practice at a lower level, and continues along the path in interaction with the knowledge directly seen, quotes, in contemplation. Thus, it will be necessary to first sketch a brief outline of the Platonic understanding of the nature of reality. I'm just turning the page. The highest, ultimate, truest, most really being, in fact, the only thing fully being, reality, is the one or the good, the self-existent absolute, the source of everything. This is really beyond predication, hyper-one, hyper-good, hyper-beautiful, existence beyond existence, pure knowledge without knower and known, absolute sentience without subject and object at all. It is not only completely without time and space, but even beyond eternity and infinity. This is really all that is. It is our origin and goal. Without it, neither we nor anything else would be even to the degree that we are and they are. It is the ground of all experience, and our whole aim is to return entirely to this. The true noetic love at the base of our soul that is the propelling force on the path is for this one only. The one in its hyper-perfection emanates without being in the slightest bit altered or affected or losing any of its total independence. The next, quote, descending order of reality, nous. That's, nous is a Greek word, N-O-U-S, commonly translated as intellect, but which here will be rendered the divine mind thought. It's really a difficult word to render into English by one term accurately. Here, a degree of nescience has arisen so that there is a degree of multiplicity. This is the realm of the Platonic forms or ideas, which are, however, not different from the divine mind that eternally and unchangingly contemplates them. Here, subject and object have emerged and become distinct, but are not separated. Unlike the chaotic multiplicity of the sense world, here there is only one each of the eternal ideas. There is no change or time or space, but their divine paradigms of eternity, infinity, and the interrelation of the forms have appeared. One must resist the temptation to imagine nous as spatially separate from the one or emerging in time from it. It is more like a lesser degree of being or reality being discriminated within it by nescience. The divine mind thought, although lacking the hyper-perfection of the one, still is perfect enough to emanate another lower order of being or reality while remaining unchanged itself. This is the level of soul, both the world soul, or the soul of the all, and our individual souls. Here, subject and object have split up, and time and space and multiplicity and change have appeared. Soul creates, so to speak, the apparent multiple object space-time world by projecting the forms of the divine mind thought into multiple partial reflections, trying to thus approximate the totality that has now been seemingly lost at this last and lowest level of being. Soul, however, unlike the two higher levels, is unable to remain unchanged in the process, and is continually caught up in and is part of its own experience. Is part of its own projection, is caught up in and part of its own projection. The experiential field of the world soul contains all time and space simultaneously, encompasses the whole all, including all at once all the modifications reflected in it of the modifications of each of the experiential fields of the individual souls brought about through their respective volitional activities, and in turn the individual souls' experiential fields are modified, reflecting all these modifications induced by their own actions and with respect to their own actions with respect to the actions of others. But the individual souls do not experience all these changes all at once like the world soul, but as a continuing series in space-time that constitutes what appears to them as an involuntarily given empirical world. I know that's kind of a long and complex sentence, but it's a long and complex thought, and really an expression of what, explanation of what is commonly referred to as karma. Again, this level is not to be thought of as actually spatially and temporally separated from the higher levels. Indeed, space and time have only just emerged at this lowest and least important level. But again, like an even lesser degree of being or reality, further discriminated within the two higher levels by a greatly increased degree of nescience. For the world and its all, there is not necessarily any fault or problem connected with its existence at this level. That is, for the world soul and its all, there is not necessarily any fault or problem connected with its existence at this level. It is merely the necessary and, in some sense, permanent radiation of the divine mind thought. For the individual souls, however, which are in some sense microcosms of the whole system, capable of in some sense existing at all three levels, being here as individuals in space-time and as objects with separate objects, in space-time and as subjects with separate objects, is the greatest of faults and errors. They have, through nescience, dared to move away existentially from the higher unities, to want to belong to themselves and objects as separate individuals, and have forgotten their true identity as really being the one. Thus they wander further and further away, deeper and deeper into nescience, forgetting the real more and more, continually projecting the forms they have forgotten as such into new supposed objects which they exalt as more important than and to themselves, and thus experience endless misery. In fact, just the fact of being here at this lowest level at all is the most hellish suffering compared to the hyper bliss of being the one, reincarnating in an endless series of forms, both human and non-human. That's really important, by the way. In these times, people think everything is really nice and groovy in this world, but besides all the obvious sufferings of billions of people and non-humans, just